Everyone to the Thursday, November 2nd meeting of the Community Preservation Committee. My name is John Campbell. I am going to ask our board members to introduce themselves as a means of roll call and also tell what association you have with another board in town or whether you're a member at large. And I'll start with Mr. Durkin at the end.
Hi, Sean Durkin. I'm on the Parks and Rec Commission, and I'm also on the Board of Directors of North Star Youth Hockey Forum.
Millie Milton. I am representative from the Planning Board, and I'm also on Historic District Commission.
Todd Helwig, Conservation Commission.
John Campbell, Open Space Committee.
Andrew Clark, at large.
Leslie Harrison, Historic District Commission, but I'm also on the Open Space Committee.
Jeff Leland, at large.
Andy Dowd, Housing Authority, and I'm also the town clerk in Northborough.
Peter Martin, at large.
Thank you, everyone. We have a guest tonight, Mr. Stuart Saginaw from the Community Preservation Coalition, Executive Director, I should say. We're very honored to have him. I'm not going to pause any longer. I'm going to give you the floor, Stuart.
All right, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So first, a little housekeeping. Okay, John, if we do this interactively and folks ask questions along the way, I think it works better that way.
Very
so,
informal here.
all right, great. As John said, I'm Stuart Saginaw from the Community Preservation Coalition in Boston. It is wonderful to attend an in-person meeting and not be sitting on Zoom. I drove a long way tonight, but I'm thrilled to be back, meeting with CPCs and out on the road and not just, sitting in a basement somewhere looking at Zoom. So kudos to you for a lot of CPCs have not begun meeting yet in person. So
It took a lot, but we got here.
Good. Kudos to you. So tonight I have an update presentation on CPA to give you kind of a bird's eye view of what's happening statewide, and then we'll kind of drill down a little bit to some of your issues. I left some time at the end to talk about White Cliffs because I know everyone has some questions about that. I did a little research that was long overdue to Lori, and talking about your options for that building, and I'm happy to answer questions and kind of just talk it out a little bit if you're not all tired of talking. So, can I just have a show of hands of anyone that's fairly new to the committee? Gives me an idea to know where to emphasize things. You're pretty experienced long-term
Andy Dowd is probably the newest member. Obviously served the town for a long time, but we did not have a housing authority representative for many years. There's kind of a gap, and Andy joined. But everyone else has been on the committee for
all right, so
10+ years.
A couple of in the middle, some basic slides, which I think I might just skip right by.
That's fine. You can keep with your presentation. Some in the audience and watching like to see anything that's informational. So
okay, great.
Don't hesitate.
All right, super. All right, so let's begin. As I mentioned, I'm from the Community Preservation Coalition. We are a nonprofit based in Boston, but we're just really a confabulation of all these other nonprofits that work in the areas of CPA. We were located until very recently at this organization in their offices and under their fiscal agency, and we have since brand new moved to an organization in Boston called Third Sector New England, which is a fiscal sponsor for smaller nonprofits like ourselves. We are still renting offices from TPL because they're right next to the State House, and that's really critical for us to be right down the street from the State House and keep an eye on what happens up there. We have folks from these organizations that sit on our steering committee. We have 8 people from local CPCs like yourself who sit on our steering committee and some at-large members. So there's 21 folks who meet quarterly and kind of guide the operation of the coalition. And the things we do, I think, for lack of a better term, are the things that most municipal trade associations would do. I think, John, you're from the CONSCOM, right? So you have Todd's from the CONSCOM, MACC, the Massachusetts Association of CONSCOMs. There's a housing authority, MassNaro. Everyone has an organization that does education and training and advocacy and all the things that you see on the screen. And we're that organization for community preservation committees. Unfortunately, there is no state agency for CPA. All those other areas that have CPA have a state agency that kind of does regulations and questions and technical assistance. There's nothing for CPA. You will only find one page on the state website with any information on CPA, and it's really basic. There's no one to call for information, there's no technical assistance available, there's no data collection at the state level except some rudimentary financial information. So people think we're a state agency all the time. We are not. We're a nonprofit, but we really fill the gap of the fact that the state never set up a CPA agency. We support ourselves by membership dues from CPA communities. So we're very pleased that Northborough is a member of the organization, and we're pleased that about 99% of the communities are, and see the value in what we do. We also apply to grants to foundations the way other nonprofits would, and those partners also help us out financially as well. But the biggest part comes from the membership dues, so we appreciate it. That's actually our communications director, Chase Mack. If any of you have ever used our website, which I'll show you in a minute, Chase spends a serious amount of time on that, making that a great resource for you. That's actually with his wife, and they were campaigning in Milton on election day and holding signs and helping out the advocates when they were trying to adopt CPA. This thing seems to be skipping on me, so sorry about that. So I mentioned our website, communitypreservation.org. Hopefully all of you have seen that, and if not, I think you'll find it really helpful, particularly the members of the CPC. This tab that I circled right here, the Technical Assistance tab, that's really for you folks. And it opens up this giant menu that looks very neat and organized, and it is, but behind that is literally hundreds of articles on every topic you'd ever imagine of CPA. So feel free to peruse that, and you'll learn a lot in your particular category, and then if you don't find what you're looking for, you pick up the phone or shoot us an email, and we're happy to help you out with that. All right, so CPA has become really big, bigger than any of us ever would have imagined when we started working on this back in 2000, when Governor Cellucci actually started in 1990. It took 10 years to get it passed, and Governor Cellucci signed it in 2000. But we're now in more than half the cities in the state, and because we've had a lot of cities adopt CPA in the past decade, the cities are kind of late to the party, but now that we have so many cities, actually almost three quarters of the people that live in Massachusetts live in a CPA community, because we've got in Boston and Springfield and Holyoke and Cambridge and Newton and a lot of pretty much all the large cities. Worcester just adopted last year, and their new CPC is just forming right now, and I'm probably going to do their training in about a month. It's become a program that is, I think, headed for the entire state, because we don't see any slowdown in communities interested in CPA. It would not surprise me if there were 15 new communities on the ballot next year. Presidential election year is usually when it's pretty large in terms of adoption. I think we had 11 last time, and we had 17 the presidential election before that. We're seeing a ton of interest. I just got a call this week from Marlboro, right down the road, that I drove through to get here, that with some interest in CPA. They have a big mayoral election, I think, coming up very shortly. Some of the candidates have been talking about CPA. It's become a little bit of a campaign issue to pin down the candidates as how they feel about CPA. So Marlboro, depending upon who wins that election, might be a community considering CPA in the future. This is my favorite statistic. I don't know how long we'll be able to say that, but it's been 22 years, and no community has ever revoked the program. Every community that has adopted it has found it really useful for their quality of life, and we have only seen it hit the ballot 3 times to revoke it, and they all were defeated really handily. This is skipping terribly, sorry about that. So this is the map of those CPA communities. The green are the towns, and the orange is the cities. You'll see some that you are going to be surprised are cities, because they're still called towns, like the town of Barnstable and the town of Bridgewater and the town of Agawam. We have a lot of towns that actually have city councils and are a city form of government. So we still have a few of the large cities that haven't adopted. You know, Brockton, Lawrence, Lynn, Lowell recently adopted, and like I said, Worcester is the most recent. There's so many great stories in this map, but the one that I'll highlight is kind of where you are out here. You can see that Worcester County is really has a dearth of CPA communities, and it's not for lack of elections or trying. It's been on the ballot out there a lot, out this way, but it doesn't seem to pass at nearly the clip it passes to the east and to the west of Worcester County. This area in here, I think I understand why. I mean, these communities are so tiny. The amount of money they would generate from CPA would be really tiny, and the same 4 volunteers staff every committee in town. You know, it'd be tough to get a 9-member CPC. So I kind of get it there. It's a little puzzling here. I mean, I think maybe this tends to be a little bit more conservative part of the state is one reason, possibly. But we have seen a lot of activity lately in this area. So we do have some brand new communities. Westboro just up the road. West Boylston is also new within the past couple years. So it's starting to happen. Northbridge was like 3 or 4 years ago. So it's happening a little bit more out here. Lancaster was 2 years ago. So it's definitely, you're gonna be surrounded pretty soon. Yeah, Leslie?
Is it possible for some of those smaller communities to band together in some way to?
It's a great question. The state really encourages regionalization. That's actually a really good idea for an update to CPA. I'm gonna talk about legislative stuff in a little bit, but we are really looking now, the last kind of comprehensive overview of CPA was in 2012, where a lot of changes were made. That's where the recreation piece came in. We're allowing you to do recreation and some other changes. In January of 2025, the new legislative session, we want to kind of file another package of amendments, and that's a really interesting idea, to find some regionalization opportunities for CPA. That's a great idea. Thank you for that. All right, so any way you look at CPA, whether you look at that map or you look at these statistics that are on the screen, it's been just a huge success. You'll be the last group to ever see these stats. Chase just finished the new stats through the end of FY23, and tomorrow we're going to put them up on our website, and I'm going to adjust this slide. But so these are over a year old now at this point, because the state only updates it once a year. But this is the figure that's incredible. Would anyone have ever thought that 3.1, now probably about $3.3 billion has been spent and raised for CPA? It generates anywhere from $250 to $270 million a year statewide for CPA, which is not an insignificant amount of money to be split just across these 4 restricted categories. Historic preservation is definitely the most popular category, over 6,500 appropriations there. Not money-wise, because the projects tend to be a little smaller. You guys would definitely probably, with White Cliffs, maybe raise the statewide average right up there on historic projects, but the money actually rolls up pretty evenly in the different categories. But in terms of numbers of appropriations, historic is the most popular. We're definitely over 35,000 acres at the end of FY23 with these new stats for open space. This is clearly the hottest category of CPA because of that 2012 amendment that expanded the uses in that category, made it a lot easier for communities to rehabilitate their existing parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields. There were only 500 projects that have ever been funded between 2000 and 2012. And now look at the number just since 2012. So this is the most difficult category of CPA. Housing is expensive and politically charged and takes forever, but still 26,000 units have received some type of help from CPA. And we'll dig into these categories a little bit more as the presentation goes on. So most of you might know this, but I think people always are surprised to find out a few details of the money piece of CPA. So there's really 2 main revenue sources. Your local surcharge revenue, you guys have a 1.5% surcharge. We have about 70 communities or so that have a full 3% surcharge, and then the rest are, 0.5% one, 1.5%. Harvard had a 1.1% surcharge. I have no idea why, but they just raised that to 3% after 20 years, actually. So that's your local money. Yes?
Sorry, another quick question.
Yeah.
Would you find that, do many communities change once they start? Do they end up adjusting?
We've had probably a dozen, give or take, that have raised and lowered.
Okay.
We've had communities raise, then lower, lower, then raise. So there's some people that have done it more than once.
Okay.
Amber started out at 0.5%, then went to 1%, then I think went to 1.5%, and then 3%. So yes, it's one of the benefits of the program. You can change your surcharge at any time. I will tell you that the days of 3% are long gone. We haven't seen more than 2 or 3 communities adopt at 3% in the past decade. 1.5% is I call it the Goldilocks percentage. You know, it's not too high, it's not too low, it's right in the middle. And when you look at the stats of the success ratio of communities at the ballot on 1.5%, 1.5% passes like 82% of the time. And all the other ones, so half, 1%, 2%, 3%, are in like the 59 to 60% ratio. It's bizarre. I don't know if I can clearly explain it, except for the Goldilocks effect of 1.5%. But when communities are kind of struggling, you know, on their surcharge and they're in that range and they're new, we always, you know, cite that stat and say, give a shot at 1.5, because it seems to pass, and it worked here too. So the other piece of your revenue is really what I call the magic of CPA, which is the trust fund money that comes in. You know, I'm not so sure that we'd have any of the 195 communities if there wasn't this matching money. I mean, that's really the big benefit of CPA. But there's some storm clouds on the horizon there, which I'm going to get into in a second. Your fund also earns interest. I hope your fund earns interest. It's statutorily required that the town track how much interest is attributed to your fund, and then pays it out to you, usually once a year when they close the books. They transfer that interest. That never used to amount to much, but I'm starting to see it add up now in this interest rate environment. So, good thing to check and make sure. I did find a few communities, I think Southborough was one of them, that has kind of slipped between the cracks and they weren't getting their interest. And there's no way to get it in the rears, you know. So it's a good thing to check your annual financial reports and make sure that that is being distributed to your fund every year. So let's dig into these two funding sources, and particularly the trust fund money. So, believe it or not, the trust fund money primarily does not come from the state budget. Most people think it would just be a state budget item, but it's not. It's much better than that for us. It's a fee assessed on documents filed at the state's registries of deeds, and it was a new fee added in 2000 specifically for CPA. So, every time you go to the registry and you're filing a mortgage discharge, orders of condition for the conscom, any paper you file at the registry, there's a chart at the window and it says, here's how much you're going to pay to the state to record that document. $50 of every one of those documents goes to the CPA trust fund. Municipal lien certificates are $25, but all the other documents are $50. So, and then the rest of the money usually goes to the state, to the general fund. This is a funding source that any other program would love to have. It is not subject to appropriation by the legislature. They can't do anything with the money. It's a true trust fund. It goes from the window at the registry to a bank account at DOR marked CPA trust fund, and statutorily the only thing that can happen with that money is it comes out as a check to you folks in about 10 days' time. We're waiting right now on the match by November 15th for this past year. So it's a terrific funding source. Unfortunately, as the map has grown with green and orange on it, and the real estate market has gone like this, you know, the match really slid dramatically. And so in about 2009, we started talking with the legislature about raising that fee. This used to be $20 and $10. That was the fee up until 2019. It took us from 2007 to 2019 to get that bill passed at the legislature to provide an increase in the deeds recording fee. But the legislature really does like CPA. Most legislators have CPA in their district. It gets tremendous support up there. So what they started doing is saying, look, we can't do that right now, but we will start giving money to the trust fund from the state's annual budget surplus if it's available. And that's added up to about $118 million over the past decade. I think we've gotten it 9 out of 11 years, 8 or 9 out of 11 years. We've gotten money from the state budget surplus. So it's another wonderful funding source. The Registry of Deeds money is guaranteed. This is something that we have to advocate for every year, and that's what our organization does, starting takes from the spring until now, to work on this and see if we get it. Last year, you guys got $203,000 in the November distribution, and then you got a decent check, which was a 38.5% match from the surplus funding. It actually came in two pieces, because the surplus was done separately from the regular match. When we talk about percentage matches with CPA, when we say 38.5%, what we mean is 38.5% of what you folks collected locally. So this figure is 38.5% of that figure. And that's the same for every community in the state on the first round of the trust fund. Last year, everyone got 38.5% of what they raised locally. So yours was 55,000. Gosnell got about $400 on their $3,000 of total revenue, and Boston got, I don't know how many million on their $25 million of revenue. Yes, sir.
How has that 38% varied over the years?
Great question. For the first 6 years of CPA, when did you pass?
04 election.
Yeah, I was going to say it's before my time.
05 town meeting.
Okay. So your first 2 or 3 years, or maybe 4, you had 100% match. The first 6 years of CPA, it was 100%. And that's because the communities that adopted were mostly smaller, like Northborough, or even my community. I live up in Boxford on the North Shore. We adopted in 2001. And I was chairing my CPC for 5 years. I joined the coalition in 2006. But those were the typical types of communities early on, and the real estate market was going crazy. That's when interest rates were falling, and you'd see people refinance in January. The rates would fall 2%, they'd refinance in May, and then you'd refinance again in November on the same property. And all those was like ka-ching, ka-ching for the trust fund. And there was more than enough money. There was a big surplus every year, so it was able to pay out 100%. But once that caught up and the real estate market started to slide and the word got out about CPA, it had reversed, and it got down to, if we hadn't got any surplus money, we would have been at 11% in 2019. So we just got that bill passed to raise the fee in the nick of time. It was about to fall into the single digits. So, you can see it's rebounded now back up to 38. It was 46, I think, the year before that. The first year we got that big infusion of money from the increase. So it varies pretty widely. But it's a very timely question, because I don't have great news for you. I'm so sorry about this clicker. It's time for a new one. I don't have great news about this year's match. The trust fund is down 30% year to date. You all know what's happening in the real estate market. There's no volume. We make our money on volume. It's not a percentage of the purchase price. If we got a percentage of the purchase price, when I started in 2006, the average home in Massachusetts was around 300,000, and now it's, I don't know, 575, 600, something like that. That would be great, but we just get a flat fee, $50. So it's been dramatically reduced by the slowdown in the real estate market, and also the refinancings. For a long time, all the refinancings were generating a decent revenue for the trust fund. No one is refinancing now. There's, no one's giving up their 2.9% mortgage to refinance at 8%. So DOR projected a 20% match in November. We were tracking it all summer. We felt the 20% was about the right guess, and DOR confirmed that in September. We are still advocating for some money from the surplus, but it's not looking good. We actually had it in the spring in the Senate budget. They allocated $30 million for the trust fund, which would have been the highest so far. And that would have got us pretty darn close to last year's number. So that would have made the difference between the 20% and the 38% from last year. The Senate gave it to us in their version of the budget, but if you know how legislative things work, they can then go into what's called the conference committee, where the House and Senate reconcile their differences. They, unlike you folks who have to have a public meeting and are having a public meeting right now, the state exempts itself from the public meeting law. So the first thing that every conference committee does is they vote to close their meetings to the public. So we don't know what happened behind those closed doors, but when the final conference committee budget came out in July, the CPA line item was removed. So we're still working on it. They always do a supplemental budget at the end of the fiscal year, and that still has not been released from House Ways and Means. So we just sent another letter today to House and Senate Ways and Means, trying to advocate and showing them these, these numbers, and we sent a big chart showing monthly the huge decline. It's off by $18 million and change. So it's a big decline. I'm not that optimistic, though. I know that the state budget surplus is really in tough shape this year. So, and they have a lot of other expenses on the emergency shelter for migrants, and they're really struggling right now to figure things out. So that supplemental budget should have been out. It was due by October 31st, but they're typically, really take some time to figure that out. So we're still advocating. At this point, it will not be in your check. You're just going to get money from the trust fund on November 15th. If we are successful in getting some surplus money, it would be like last year. You'd get a second check, maybe in December. Last year it came out in December, the second check. The year before, we got 10 million, I think, and it came out in January. Last year we got 20 million from the surplus, so it was really, really terrific. Any questions on the trust fund? Yes?
Is there any chance of getting it included as a regular annual budget item?
Interesting you should say that. So in 2012, as an annual regular budget item, no. The legislature never puts anything in the budget that is more than 1 year. They never want to bind themselves. It's kind of the same way your town works. Your town can't really bind itself, except for a bond, can't really bind future town meetings in terms of what they're allocating for the budget. So as a regular budget item, no. But in 2012, when we got the big piece of policy legislation passed, we also had asked for that D fee increase. And they said, we can't give it to you, but we're going to start giving you the first 25 million of the budget surplus every year. And so the bill was written when it went into that closed conference committee as, in every fiscal year, the first 25 million of the state's budget surplus shall go to the CPA trust fund. When it came out at 3 a.m. in the middle of the night from the conference committee, instead of saying at the end of every fiscal year, it said in FY13, the first 25 million. So we got 25 million that 1 year, but now we have to go back every single year and advocate for it. So they usually do not want to dedicate anything. They usually want to give themselves flexibility because, in all fairness, things do change, right? And other priorities happen, and they don't want to be locked into a lot of promises. So great question, though. That was one of the worst nights of my life, frankly. I was out doing a presentation in Petersham, and the cell service and the internet service was terrible, and someone called me and said, the budget is out. It came out of conference committee, and I'm on some weak Wi-Fi trying to read this 5,000 line budget, and I get to the point, and instead of saying, in every fiscal year, the first 25 million, it says in FY13. So you win some and you lose some, but it still has added up to $108 million over the past decade or so. All right, so John, I'll roll through these slides a little quicker because these are sort of the basic CPA slides in case anyone was new. Some of the things that the CPC is responsible for, I'm assuming you have a public hearing every year that's required by the law. I sometimes see communities that have had CPA for a long time have sort of missed the step of having a CPA plan, but it is required that every community have a CPA plan and update that every year. It doesn't have to be, it's not a master plan type material, and it doesn't have to be completely rewritten, but you do have to provide a light update to that plan every year. If you list your projects in the plan, you would list the next years. If you list your committee members, you would change that, but that's something that you're required to do. This is a best practice. Hopefully you guys are getting regular financial reports from the town as to what's in your accounts. It's good to keep on top of that. Mistakes are made. Hopkinton had to hire a forensic accounting firm to figure out their CPA accounts, because they had a bunch of changes in the finance department and there wasn't any consistency there. And seeing a lot of turnover, actually. I don't know if your town has had a lot of turnover. You have.
Yes.
Seeing an amazing amount of turnover among municipal officials right now. Really, really tough time to have any consistency in staffing. So it's important to keep on top of that. And then these are the main reasons you exist, right? To prepare a budget every year and recommend that, and then to recommend projects every year. By the way, I forgot to mention, these little numbers in the corner here, these we call bookmarks. Tomorrow morning, you're all going to get a copy of this presentation by email. I'll send it to all of you. Those bookmarks have links on our website for more information. So any page that has a bookmark, you'll be able to click on the link in my email tomorrow morning and get more information. All right, so the one great thing about CPA is it doesn't stipulate a lot of requirements. It really lets you guys decide how you want to spend your money. I think that is the strongest part of CPA, is the local control. The state even says when that check comes from the state, as soon as it hits your account and is deposited, it's considered local money. There's no approvals required from the state. That's a terrific thing, to have complete flexibility on that funding. The only rule it does say is that every year you have to spend or reserve for later spending 10% in each of the three categories: housing, open space and rec, and historic. Open space and recreation share a reserve account. By open space, we mean conservation land activities, and by recreation, it would be active outdoor recreation, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, and things like that.
By the way, Stuart, could I interrupt? I just want to be certain that I understand that, because it
Yep.
did change. The 10% minimum can apply to either open space or recreation,
Correct.
and you meet it, okay.
Yeah, and that was one of the changes in 2012. Before 2012, recreation had no reserve account.
Right.
And this could only be spent on conservation land purchases, mostly. There are a few other things you can do. There's not much you can do in the conservation category other than protect conservation land. And it was actually the cities who requested, our best ideas come from Leslie and other people. The cities said, hey, we don't have any conservation land to buy in Cambridge, and we built up that fund, to $1.5 million. What are we gonna spend that on? And so it was really the cities who requested that be opened up, and you can use it for either, you can split it, you can do rec this year, for the next 4 years, and then do a conservation.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, so completely flexible. And then, of course, you can always set aside up to 5% for administration, which I know you do as well. All right, that administrative account, folks always have questions on that. It's difficult to parse out. There's no, regulation from DOR on what can be in the administrative account. But typically, the type of things that CPCs are, staff support, as you're doing your due diligence on a project. I just got a question today from, forget what community it was, Falmouth. They said, we have a really complicated historic application in front of us, and we really want to hire a historic preservation consultant to make sure they're doing the work according to the Secretary of Interior standards, which is required for CPA. Can we use our admin fund for that? And I said, that's exactly what the admin fund is for. And so any assistance that you need in doing your due diligence on projects and project recommendations is fair game. If you have your ad for the public hearing, that sort of thing. It is not for project expenses, and that's a mistake that a lot of folks make, and there might have been some mistakes here in the past too with White Cliffs in terms of some things being paid for out of the administrative fund. I mean, there's no CPA police, mistakes are made, but it is not for, the common question we get is, they bid the project, it was $100,000, all the bids came in at $120,000. Can we take the balance out of the administrative fund? And the answer to that is no. It's not a project expense budget. It's an expense budget of your committee, the expenses to run your committee. Yeah, Lori.
White Cliffs.
Yeah.
So could you use the administration funds to hire an architect to prepare a plan for like demolition of additions? So that would support a future application, which would be the actual demolition of, additions that are not historically relevant.
Right.
But it is design work, so.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Okay.
And I don't think there really is a clear answer to that question. You know, it really would be a local decision by the CPC. I think one of the ways that we tell whether something is a true administrative expense of this committee is where did the request come from to do that? If the request came from anyone but this committee, it's probably not a good expense for the administrative account. You don't accept applications to use the administrative account. Like the Historic Commission, the Selectmen, the Planning Department cannot apply to use the administrative account. They apply for project funds.
Okay.
But if one of the committee members, you know, if they had a different White Cliffs application in front of them and they said, well, gee, before we do this, we really should have a study, you know, of this, that would be a little different. It's a nuance, but it would be an initiative of the committee at that point. So that's one of the ways to tell is who's asking for the work to be done, right? If it's coming from somewhere else, not the best use of administrative funds. But, you know, CPA is a local program. You know, there's politics involved in everything, and, you know, a request like that, having to go through town meeting, you know, as a project expense, a small amount of money, and might generate, you know, all sorts of politics around that. So it's a tough one. I wish I had a clearer answer, but hopefully I kind of gave you some guidance to be able to figure that out. All right. So now let's talk about the actual spending of the money, which is the last big section I have for you, and we can talk about White Cliffs too in more detail. CPA actually doesn't say anything about the application process. It actually starts at the point where it says, the CPC shall make recommendations to the legislative body for, and then it lists all the things you can spend money on. So anything to do with the application process is really up to you folks on the CPC. You have complete local control. But there's some best practices and patterns that have come out from that in terms of, first, who can apply for CPA funds. You know, these are the two big categories, you know, the town itself and town departments and local nonprofits. Those are really the two categories. I don't think the legislature really thought this was going to be part of CPA. I don't think they really thought it through because these type of applications are difficult because there's the whole idea of spending public money on private assets and how do you guarantee public benefit. They're a big use of CPA funds, but they deserve a little bit more scrutiny. And there's no guidance in the CPA. So I think the legislature, when they created it, you know, 25 years ago, was really thinking about this just being a fund for town assets. But we've turned it into so much more, which is fine. It doesn't say anything about that in the legislation. Again, because there's no yes or no, these are not yes and no. You know, these are, you know, pretty basic, and you got to look really close in terms of the list. So the first caution is non-incorporated entities. You see that sometimes, the Friends of the Prescott Park, you know, but they're just a loose organization of friends groups. You see that more in cities. There's neighborhood groups all over cities that often are not incorporated entities that apply for CPA funding. We see folks sometimes who have historic homes who apply for, you know, individual grants. You know, it doesn't say you can't do that, but do you really want to be debating Mrs. Johnson's, you know, 1810, you know, house on Main Street at town meeting, on town meeting 4? Maybe some people don't like Mrs. Johnson. So the way to do this sort of thing is to create a program for historic, let's say, facade improvements in historic districts or whatever you wanted to put as a limit on it, and then find an agency to administer that program, and then you give a pot of money, you know, as a grant, and then that agency accepts the applications and does all that. It's not for the faint of heart. You need a really sophisticated professional staff to do it. The only two that I've seen have been Cambridge and Springfield, who have done these type of programs, and they both have, you know, paid historic commissions. Cambridge has like 7 or 8 people in their historic commission, paid members, and they've been doing it for years with CDGB money. Privately owned historic buildings, particularly commercial and religious ones, not nonprofits. We're starting to see a lot more commercial properties in historic districts apply for funding. And, you know, if it's exterior funding on the facade and it contributes to the character of the historic district, and, you know, it's definitely to the public's benefit to have, you know, a beautiful historic building and not have dilapidated exteriors there. So, you know, it would take definitely some structure and make sure it was done properly. But we are seeing, you know, a few more. Again, more in cities that have big professional staffs. Fall River does that sort of thing. Lowell has a great downtown historic building facade improvement program that they administer. So we're seeing a little bit more in that area. Religious institutions are tough. We never really thought they were tough. There were hundreds of projects that gave money to historic religious buildings because they usually are the very fabric of, you know, New England communities. But then the town of Acton was famously sued about a decade ago, and since then it's been a difficult category because the lawsuit went to the SJC and the decision was clear as mud. So it's made it difficult. What have you folks done with have you received any applications from religious organizations?
Yes,
And what have you done with those?
approved some, primarily at one major church in town, which is, you know, quite an historic site in our historic district.
Yep.
But we've been looking closely at the question with respect to it just came up a year or two ago. We started studying it a little closer with regard to that Acton decision.
Yeah. More communities than I thought have proceeded to continue giving grants. I thought this would, and the lawyer for Acton really, you know, said to the SJC, it's gonna have a chilling effect on historic preservation of these buildings. But I have seen a lot more communities do what you folks are doing than communities. North Andover, I know, does not do them because their town council opined against it, but I've seen more activity than I thought I would continue in that area. I think the shoe is gonna drop, you know, on the other foot, or whatever that expression is, at some point. We kinda need another lawsuit to iron this out and get us, you know, clarity on one direction or another, because it really was left unfinished, unfortunately. Yeah, Mark?
Let's do it. The way when I was on the commission and the requests were coming in from Unitarian Church, the way I was understanding the lawsuit was if it was exterior and it was improving something that was visible to the whole community, it was probably acceptable. But if you're doing something inside into the building, then, which is really focused on the church community itself, that would be clearly unacceptable.
Right.
So that's kind of where the logic we were using when we got these requests into the Historic District Commission, so.
And I think most folks use that logic. The part that I think is rock solid is the absence of spending public money on the interior. I think that's a really generally accepted practice. But even on the exterior, you know, the Acton lawsuit was all about, if we spend money on this exterior, it's gonna take away from our religious mission
That's what
activities.
we've been doing, right?
And so basically you have public money funding religious mission activities. So even though it's exterior and it's clearly to the benefit of the community, that was the issue that the SJC flagged. So our best practice advice is to, when you get the application, send them to town council and don't try to muddle through them yourselves. And the court referred to something called the Helms test, HELMES, which is a 3-part test to determine whether the benefit is for the public benefit or for the private benefit of the organization. It's a very complicated, obscure test. And the best thing is just to send the application to town council and say, please step through the Helms test on this application and tell us whether we can fund it. And then if it's eligible, then you folks can have a discussion as to whether you want to do it. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but that seems to be the best practice. So, Todd, is your firm fielding applications from
Most
CPCs?
of our towns are in that white region that you mentioned previously, that have not adopted it.
Yes.
For some bizarre reason. But I was wondering though, since KP Law probably represents half of the communities,
Yep.
I assume they're in us. The answer's pretty consistent from them as to what you can do. They wouldn't have a blanket. I would think that the law firm is giving consistent advice to all of its communities. You might not know, you may or may not know that.
You may think that.
Oh, all right. Well,
Yet, you know, we see KP decisions from all sorts of different towns, you know, and they have, I don't know, what, 100 lawyers or 50 lawyers, whatever. And I clearly have seen from KP, a town that has CPA, that bought land, and their town council said, you can have this vote be a majority vote at town meeting. And then another KP lawyer said, nope, all land purchases are 2/3 vote.
Could someone explain KP, the new guy?
It's the largest municipal law firm in Massachusetts. Used to be called
Copeland and
Page,
Page.
now it's just KP Law. Yeah, and they represent you folks?
Yes.
Yeah, in my town too, they do my town as well. So, in general, I think, yes, they have, you know, principles, but you're really not, your town council is really not KP Law, it's the individual who's assigned, that is your town council, it's that person's name. And they do have different, they're lawyers, right? Do lawyers have different opinions sometimes, or?
They do, but I'd like to think they'd have a consistent
Right.
voice on that subject.
Yeah. And I don't, and they may on the religious one, I haven't seen many of their opinions on it. We don't typically see the legal opinions.
Forgive me for asking you to backtrack a little bit, but maybe for the benefit of the public and anybody watching. Can you summarize quickly what the lawsuit was about in Acton, how it affected CPA?
Yeah. So Acton received 2 applications from 2 different churches in town. One was for a master plan to look at the whole building and see what it needed. The other one was for some stained glass window repairs, stained glass that had religious imagery. There's a couple of national organizations that fight for separation of church and state. Freedom from Religion Foundation and I forget the name of the other organization, but that's the one that sued. Now they didn't have any standing to sue, this organization from DC, but they found 10 local taxpayers who were members of their organization, and they sued Acton, and they said, we feel this application, these 2 applications are in violation of the state's anti-aid amendment. So the lawsuit was about the state's anti-aid amendment. We have an amendment to our state's constitution. It's from the 1800s that is still on the books. And it says you cannot give public money to a private organization, particularly a private religious organization. It says it in black and white. And it was actually done by a group called the No Name Party at the time, and they were trying to keep funding from going to private Irish Catholic institutions, because that's when the Irish were coming over, and folks who were here, you know, wanted to restrict their activities, and they passed the anti-aid amendment saying you couldn't fund religious schools, and it was really, they were really aiming it at Irish Catholic schools. But we still have this law on the books. Now, it's been interpreted through the court a few places to say it's not an outright ban on public money to private organizations. It's a ban on public money going to private organizations for private purposes. But you can give public money to a private organization if it fulfills a public purpose. So that's the court rulings that have happened on the anti-aid amendment in the 150 years it's been around. So that's what the organization and the 10 taxpayers in Acton were suing on. What's ironic is at the same time, there was a federal case on the federal constitution, on the anti-establishment clause, the separation of church and state federally. And in that case, the federal Supreme Court went to the opposite direction of what the Massachusetts Supreme Court did. They basically said, you can't deny a religious organization applications for this public funding program. It was a park program, a school playground program, and private religious schools were applying. And the state said, no, it's only for public schools. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't discriminate against these organizations for religious reasons. So they have to be eligible for the program as well, which kind of makes sense. And that decision came out at the exact same time that the SJC decision came out here in Massachusetts. But our lawsuit was on the anti-aid amendment to our Constitution, which is much more strict than the federal one. And the decision was really muddy. But in essence, the court did say definitely not to the stained glass with the religious imagery. And they remanded the other applications back to the lower court to sort through this three-part Helms test. And they said, we're sending this back to the Superior Court. You need to sort through the three-part Helms test and make a decision on the other applications. At that point, Acton had spent $250,000 to defend themselves. The grants totaled $80,000. And the church probably had spent, both churches, they both withdrew their applications at that point. So the case was never finished. So that's why it's a little muddy right now. So we know for sure one thing is not okay, stained glass religious imagery. But the court seemed to have cast doubt that the other things were okay as well. But there was no clear decision.
Well, we have we had an application last year that was for, you know, windows and cupola and steeple repair, which is for the private benefit of the structure because it was based upon water penetration in the thing. I guess visually it is a public space because it's a visual component of the town's, our historic zone.
Right?
But it also is private benefit because it's only benefiting the people of the, you know, it's only benefiting the church people from a structure, you know, saving them money for from rebuilding the thing.
Yeah, and that's what the SJC focused on, is one of the, you know, we always wonder why did they sue Acton? Because they sent a public records request to every CPA community asking for copies of their church projects. You folks, I'm sure, received a public records request on that. Yet they sued Acton. We were joking in the office, well, they just, you know, there were hundreds of these projects, so they just went to the A and they sued Acton. But they didn't. They sued for a very particular reason. They sued because they thought they had a case on the stained glass religious imagery, and they sued because one of the applicants, one of the churches, said, if we spend money on this exterior, it takes away from our religious mission. They said that in the application. And the SJC and the people who filed the case were all over that. I mean, they circled that phrase right there, and they said, this is the crux of the issue, is that, you know, if they have to spend the money on this repair, it's going to take away from the religious mission, and should the town public money be funding that religious mission? Because in essence, that's what you're doing at that point. So, but on the other side, if it's visible from the street, and, you know, it's, you know, the picture-perfect New England postcard with the steeple and the New England church that defines the character of, you know, hundreds of our towns, you know, having that looking great is to the public benefit too. So it's a tough issue. All right, so we digress, huh?
Sorry about that, keep going, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Just a few slides left. Anyone seen this chart before?
Mm-hmm.
This is definitely the most important piece of paper in the CPA world. It's a CPA allowable uses chart. This is a simple version. We have the official DOR version on our website. The only difference is the DOR version has all the definitions of these words in small print on the side. This basically is the essence of how you make a decision on a CPA project. This is the visual representation of Section 5B2 of the law, which is this long, complicated thing that only Todd and other lawyers would enjoy, that says what you can spend your money on. And I'll be honest, until this chart came out from DOR in 2005, none of us were quite sure what we could spend CPA money on. But then DOR came out with this, and it was like, you know, like a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? It still doesn't make it easy. Allowable uses is the hardest thing. It's probably 80% of the technical assistance questions we get is, can we spend money on this? So here's how you use this chart. I mean, this is obvious, right? We all know the 4 categories of CPA. But these have definitions, and not everything in the entire category applies to CPA funding. What folks don't realize is you also have to justify a project by one of these verbs. So if you are not acquiring something, creating it, preserving it, supporting it, or rehabilitating it, it's not eligible for funding. And you can see not every verb is available in every category. Some are yes, some are no, and some are no, but maybe. So, you know, you have to basically look at every application, and this is why it's critical to get a budget with every application. You really, to do this right, you need to review every line item in a budget and find a box on this chart where you can stuff that line item. You know, say, yes, that line item to pay Mr. Johnson for his farm and acquire his conservation land, that is acquisition of open space. It's in this box. I see a yes, I can do it. And sometimes you need a couple boxes for the different line items in a project. You know, if you were rehabbing a historic building into housing, you know, you might have, you know, a couple of boxes that you need. But if you can't find a box that says yes, the project is not eligible for funding. So I'll give you a real life example. Let's say you get an application to fund an oral history of World War II veterans from the Historical Society or the Historical Commission. There's only 12 World War II veterans left in Northborough. They want to capture their stories, hire a professional video company, interview them, get their stories, obviously important to the history of the town, make a video, put it on the local cable channel, distribute it to the schools and the library. $20,000 to hire the production company and do the video editing. All right, well, let's see. First of all, that's obviously in the historic category. There's a definition for this. A historic resource is a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact. Those are the only 6 things that are available for funding in the historic category. So, are you acquiring, when you do this oral history project, are you acquiring a historic building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact? Are you buying that?
No.
No, you're not. Are you preserving it, meaning protect it from injury or harm through physical work? Are you doing any physical work to a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, artifact to preserve it? You are not. And you're also not rehabilitating one of those 6 items. Not eligible for funding. In fact, the box where it really belongs is create. You're making a video production, a new video production. It's about history, but it's a new video production. And this one applies too. It's something that definitely supports the historic preservation category, but support is not available in any category except for housing. So that's kind of the way you use the chart. And it's really important to match the chart with the line items in a budget that you receive. And the budgets, you know, they're not, projects aren't bid at the time they're getting to you, so the budgets are estimates, you know, and they will change, and you understand that. But you do need to see a budget. You do need to know what people are spending the money on. A lot of times people make the mistake in the applications of describing the project, but don't really get down to what is actually the money going to be spent on. And that's the critical part for you folks to determine eligibility is what will the CPA money be by in this project. You know, you can see a budget to rehab this historic building. I don't know if this is a historic building, let's say it is. You know, and until you look through the budget and you see that they have actually, you know, asked for money for furniture and big screen TV at the front door, you know, listing all the departments. Well, that's not historic preservation, you know, of the building. That's what they call FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. But until you look through the budget, you don't know that until you see the different line items. So I could spend all night on this, but we're already over time. So, but any questions on the allowable uses chart?
No, sir. And by the way, the meeting is essentially for you. So
Okay.
as long as you want to keep going, I'm going to stay.
I think I have 4 more slides, I think.
Yeah,
So,
please don't rush.
and then we can just spend some time talking about White Cliff. So to further make the point, the chart is just about the eligibility. And what I see sometimes is folks spend a long time arguing about the eligibility, you know, because it's not easy. And maybe even have to ask town council to opine, because they're the final decision maker. Or maybe you want to get our opinion on it, we're happy to give it. But in the end, it's decided, yes, it's eligible for funding. If you argue about it for a while, there's this feeling at the end of that process that we're going to do it. You know, like we argued for this long time about whether it's eligible, and now there's an expectation, yeah, you're going to do it. Well, no, that's just the first process, right? Once it's eligible, now you gotta talk about whether it makes sense, right? And the CPC's job is not to just pass along eligible applications. We actually get that question from a lot of CPCs. You know, do we have to pass along an application to town meeting just because it's eligible? And we're like, no, they wouldn't need a CPC. I mean, they would've just had, the law would have been written like, your town attorney shall look at all applications and eligible ones shall be placed on the warrant at town meeting. You know, we have a CPC and a really diverse CPC just for that whole process of due diligence. So, you know, you wanna ask yourself, does it fit your CPA plan that hopefully you have? How does it compare to other applications that cycle? How many times have you got an application and you read it and it's just not ready for prime time? It's an idea, but it's not really fully fleshed out, or it's way ahead of itself. You know, how many times you get an application, you know, and it's easy to, CPA's the easy money, frankly, you know, applying for state grants, poor Lori, that, you know, that's her job, and it's not easy, you know, or having bake sales, or, you know, sending out fundraising letters, having events, those are really hard, you know? And so a lot of times people just throw the application into the CPC and not really do the hard work to also, you know, come up with some matching funds. So these are all the things that you would, of course, consider. And I know you guys are a pretty thoughtful CPC, and I'll bet this is how you do your process. So we talked about this a little bit. We got ahead of ourselves, but you know, every project has to have public benefit. If it's on a public asset, it's automatic. But if it's on a private asset, you really need to have a conversation at the CPC of how we're protecting the public benefit. Maybe we're asking for a preservation restriction on that private asset. That's automatically to the public benefit. If you get a preservation restriction back, the town now owns that preservation restriction. It's a real property interest, and that is clearly to the public benefit. But there are other ways to guarantee public benefit. You know, access, clawback agreements. There's a lot of different ways, and you need to have a discussion about that every time and make sure that you've been thoughtful about this private application having public benefit, because that's what, as we discussed, what the anti-aid amendment is all about. All right, so let's talk about, dig into a few of these categories. I think I have one slide on a couple of each of these categories. We are seeing a tremendous amount of pressure right now from housing organizations, the state, advocacy groups on CPA for housing. You know, it is the #1 crisis in our state right now, clearly, and a lot of CPA communities do a great job with housing, but very honestly, a lot of other communities don't. I live in one that does a terrible job addressing our housing needs. You know, I stood in front of town meeting 6 times when I was chair with housing projects, and I went 0 for 6. And so, you know, it's tough, because every CPA project has to go and get approval at town meeting, and housing can be very controversial and difficult. But we're now seeing, you know, a collision of the state and really wanting to get communities more involved with housing. There was this MBTA communities law, if you're really into the wonkiness of policy planning. Lori knows all about that. And there's more coming, and more pressure coming for communities to, you know, get on board with making sure we have adequate housing. So I do think one of the things that keeps us up at night is that we're gonna see some policies submitted by special interest groups. The realtors are very interested in changing CPA to benefit their category. And so we're sort of just setting the groundwork for folks to really give consideration and think through and be proactive on housing. You know, you see this thing all the time in the big industries, you know, where the feds, you know, threaten to regulate them further if they don't get their act together, and then they form a trade association among all the companies and kind of put some consumer-friendly policies in place. It's kind of like that. But it is something we're really concerned about right now, and we're spending a lot of time. And I think we're going to be engaging a lot of folks in that conversation of maybe how we can make some changes to CPA to make it more equitable for everyone. And they're going to be tough decisions, and they're going to be, you know, tough issues. You know, our basic position is that CPA is a local program, and communities should be able to do what they want with their local money, especially if 80% of the money is coming from the local surcharge and only 20% is coming from the state match. But, you know, I will tell you that that feeling is not universally shared among others. So we think, you know, a carrot approach is a lot better than a stick approach, especially with CPA, because if there's a stick approach on CPA, as someone mentioned, communities can lower their surcharge or they can exit the program. You know, this is not a guaranteed, you know, funding source. You know, and so you hit a CPA committee with a stick too many times, they'll say, what do we need CPA anymore for? So it's an emerging issue. Yeah, Todd.
I would imagine that particularly in CPA communities that have been adopted are generally wealthier communities, and they're using that money to buy open space, to basically pull up the gates and, you know, remove land from the map that could be developed for anything else. That would seem to be a criticism that might be coming your way.
Yeah, that was actually a criticism from the very beginning of CPA. But I think it's a little bit of a false criticism. The whole purpose of CPA, the whole idea of CPA, and the reason why these 4 categories were combined, and the reason why the CPC is this diverse collection of people representing all these categories, is to make this work for the whole town as a quality of life issue. So the idea of CPA is you have money to protect the land that really should be protected, and you have money to build the housing where it should be built, you know, and it actually says in the law, you know, community housing shall be built wherever possible on previously developed sites. So it's not really an either or. It's, you know, it's let's protect the land that's really environmentally sensitive. I took a back road here. I have never been down Robin Street.
Robin Hill Road?
What's that?
Robin Hill Road?
Yes.
In Marlboro?
Yeah. Yes, Marlboro, and it comes through, and there's
Yeah.
like a reservoir there, and there's
Yeah.
fields there. It's what a fantastic road. There was all sorts of open space and farms and all interesting things. You know, that's not a great place for affordable housing, right? It looked like it was very, like there's a reservoir back there and water features and wetlands and farmland. But, you know, right along Route 20, you know, would probably be a great place for affordable housing. So it is an argument we see a lot.
And I'm not even talking about affordable housing, I'm just talking about housing.
Yeah, housing in
I
general.
mean, Harvard can make itself more like Harvard every day by buying open space.
Right. Yep. And you know, you hope that communities are thinking the way the legislature was when they created CPA, which is you got to serve both categories and protect the land that should be protected and put the housing where the housing should be. And that's the way the state's thinking with this MBTA law. They're trying to get communities to put the housing where the housing belongs. So, yeah.
I think what we've seen is that even when we have a very good and active housing association that we work with, the money, it's very expensive to develop housing. So you take $1 million and you go, oh my God, that buys us, you know, 6 units.
Right.
You know,
If that.
Yeah, or 4 units, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, $1 million might buy 20 acres of a space, you know, of a open area because the person wants to sell it and they want to preserve it and things like that. So it's disproportionate. Even though you can spend a lot of money on it, it doesn't seem to create the same kind of, say, oh wow, we just spent all that money and we made 3 units of housing.
Right.
And that's been our story here, even when a group that's been very active and working with Habitat and things like that to maximize, you know, to maximize the return on the investment.
Right. You have that great, is that Rick Leaf's the
Yeah,
organization?
Rick
I mean,
is.
they've done really tremendous work, but, you know, it's a lot of money for a few amount of units. I mean, that is one way to do it, you know, and that has great value because it's local people doing local projects, right? But along with that, you know, CPA is a lot of times used as seed money, you know, as the first money in. If a developer, even a for-profit developer or a nonprofit developer, if they can have as the very first funding source for their project a positive vote of, you know, not a huge amount of money, because you don't have a huge amount of money, but $250,000 of CPA money. And that goes to town meeting, and town meeting says, we like this project, that is gold to a housing organization. They take that to the state, it melts doors in terms of raising other funding, is the town wants this. Town meeting voted to put their own town money from CPA in this project, and they passed it at town meeting. That makes it so much easier for them to get other funding. So now your money's being really used to leverage other money. So they both have value, right? The local organizations developing 100% affordable with, you know, local organizations, and putting a little bit of money into a larger project. And it may not all be affordable, right? Your 250 might only be, you know, getting, you know, a certain amount of units there. But as Todd said, we need housing, we need every type of housing, you know, in Massachusetts. So those are a couple different strategies that communities use. All right, there's just a couple more slides left. Just some things about outdoor recreation. We do still get questions, and, you know, can we fix up an indoor basketball court or an indoor ice rink? But CPA is for outdoor recreation only. You can never, in any category of CPA, do any maintenance or ongoing operating expenses. But they're probably, the recreation category probably has more restrictions than any, because there's not a lot of restrictions in CPA. But it does say, you know, no stadiums, as I said, no indoor recreation facilities. There was a lawsuit, not only on religious institutions, but Norwell lost a lawsuit on sidewalks along roads. That's not allowed with CPA funds, because that's not dedicated recreation land. Certainly, sidewalks within a park is fine. And then artificial turf was also a change that the legislature made in 2012.
Can you go back to indoor recreation? I'm not sure I knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's for outdoor recreation only. Wasn't there an application
Yeah.
for the basketball court years and years ago?
That's not why it failed, right? What was the main reason?
It failed because it hadn't figured it out yet.
Yeah, we just, you know, the budget was wrong, we didn't have enough money yet, but we
I remember
approved
that
it.
project. But
And then,
here's the
you
deal
know.
on that one, though. Is this a historic building?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, so that probably,
is that how we brought
Yeah.
it through?
I mean, you know, a historic building has offices in it, it has meeting rooms in it, it might have a basketball court, it has bathrooms, it has a boiler. Your money's going, doesn't really care about what the building's being used for, it's the historic fabric of the building, so.
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, so I think you were fine there. I remember that project, actually.
Never did it, but.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the only times I've ever seen an okay indoor recreation project, because, and that goes back to John, that's a great thing, sorry to go back here, but that goes back to the chart. You know, I see people all the time, these four categories seem very distinct and very clear, but you really have to know what you're talking about, right? And the first thing you need to do, and it happens a lot between this category and this category, is what category are we talking about? Like, what is this land, right? You couldn't have figured out that project unless you knew this was a historic. If you were considering it in this category, you were doing something illegal. But if you were considering it right here, this was the box for that project, not this. Matter of fact, back then, might have been before 2012, might have said you couldn't even rehabilitate recreation, even outdoor recreation, but now you can.
Yeah, that was definitely.
So that's a great example on this chart, is I see so many times people struggle to not really think through what the category is. And you can't go anywhere without first doing that. All right, and now we're on to the last, heading to the Whitequist discussion, if you want to talk about that. So we actually talked about this, the definition of historic preservation. And furthermore, if it's one of those 6 things, it also has to be one of those 6 things on the state register, or if it's not on the register, the local historic commission. Do you do that? Do you send things if they haven't had CPA funding before to the historic commission to get a vote from them? To deem
Typically,
it
we're
historic?
getting, you know, Norm was involved in it for quite some time, but typically, we're getting, you know, the recommendation, or so far, it's been those properties that in town are universally accepted as our historic resources.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say, Norm?
Yes, you're right, John.
All right, so, Lori,
Couldn't have found a better picture.
Chase, our communication director, did this presentation. I said, Chase, I need one blank slide at the end. Because Lori had asked me to delve into some issues, which I never got to. I feel bad about that. About White Cliffs. Maybe it was my subconscious not wanting me to. And I said, if you can find a picture of White Cliffs online, that would be awesome. So I actually have not seen this till right now.
Not the prettiest one,
Yeah.
actually.
But it is accurate though, isn't it? All right, so the question that had been asked was, and it may still be on the table. I know, things have been a roller coaster with White Cliffs, but, at some point it came up, and it probably will come up again, is, can we sell something when we bought it with CPA funds? And the answer is yes. You can always sell any asset, even conservation land that you acquire with CPA money. But CPA requires a deed restriction when you buy something. So the deed restriction should be put in place, and then the property would be sold as restricted to that category. So if you bought a piece of conservation land and a land trust wanted to buy it from you, or a farmer wanted to buy it from you, you could sell that to them. The money goes back into the CPA fund, and the restriction goes with that land, and it's still restricted to that category. Now here we have a situation where the restriction was never done on White Cliffs, which was, still continues to be an oversight, but there's much bigger fish to fry, and I get it. You're not the only community that hasn't, filed those restrictions in a timely fashion, even though they're required. So that really is why this was a significant question, is, well, what do you do if the restriction was never done, right? And so DOR finally came out in their new IGR a few years ago with their opinion on this, which we agree with, which is, if you didn't do the restriction, that doesn't absolve you of the fact the law said that you should have done the restriction. So there is a law in Massachusetts called Chapter 184, sections 31 to 33 deal with restrictions. And section 32 specifically talks about how you extinguish a restriction. So there are times, it's rare, but there are times where, the public purpose of that restriction are no longer valid, and there's a procedure in place to get that restriction removed. It's pretty complicated on open space or recreation land, because we have something called Article 97, which is another amendment to our state's constitution, which we won't get into here. But for historic preservation, basically what DOR is saying, and we would agree with, is you have to pretend the restriction existed because you were supposed to do the restriction. You agreed to do the restriction when you bought it with CPA money. So therefore, you have to follow the same procedure as someone else who was getting a restriction released. And it's a little easier for historic properties to get that done than it is for open space and recreation properties. You need approval by Mass Historic, and I think there's some local procedural votes too. I will tell you that Chapter 182, Section 30, Chapter 184, Section 32 is a piece of prose that only a lawyer could love.
I don't.
I don't.
Yeah, it's dense and it's hard to understand, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it. But it also does say that the property has to be sold at market value. CPA grants an exemption from the state's procurement laws when you buy land. When you want to buy White Cliffs, you don't have to put an ad in the Central Register saying, we want to buy an oversized, rundown, former historic function facility somewhere in the town of Northborough. Everyone who has one, put in your bid and we'll accept the lowest offer. You don't have to do that. When you want to buy a CPA asset, you usually want to buy that asset, that piece of conservation land, that historic building. So it exempts you from the state's procurement laws when you buy. It does not exempt you from the state's procurement laws when you sell, which is why you had to do that, when you were considering disposing of it to Metro West. That's why you did the RFP. That is the proper way to do that. But there are some, for housing purposes, there are some ways that you don't have to sell it at market value. There's another state law that allows you to reduce the price if it's going to be used for housing. But I don't think that's true for a historic property. And then that money has to go back to CPA. That's Section 6 of CPA says that all proceeds from the sale of assets acquired with CPA funds go back to the program. Todd?
I always wondered, and maybe you've seen this, although maybe based on this you haven't, is that if you just kind of say, oh shucks, this isn't gonna work, you could go back to the legislature and get a special act approved that basically says, this property no longer subject, it's out of the program,
Right.
and do it that way.
For recreation or conservation land, that is exactly what you have to do. You have to get a town meeting vote to change the use on that land, and then you have to get a bill has to be filed, and you need to get a 2/3 vote on a special act of the legislature. But now, for conservation and recreation land, the state just strengthened that law with the Public Lands Protection Act in January of 2022. And now, not only do you need the 2/3 vote of the town meeting and the legislature to sell that, you also have to go to EEA, get their approval, show an alternatives analysis that this is absolutely what you have to do, and then you have to replace that land 2-to-1 elsewhere in town with other conservation or recreation land. That was a policy of EEA, and in January of 2022, it was codified in law, and it was called the Public Lands Protection Act. There are dozens and dozens of special acts every year to remove parks and open space and conservation land from protected status, and it was really getting a little out of hand.
This is a historic structure.
Yes, this is different. This is, I don't think you need a special act. I just think you need to go through MHC.
I just wonder if MHC can be difficult to work with, and I'm just wondering whether a special act might be easier.
Yeah, I don't think that will work because of what section 32 doesn't mention a special act as a possibility, so.
I think that, again, not thought this all the way through, but I think a special act allows you to get around all the other stuff.
Yeah.
But
But will they pass that special act, when it's,
that's why we pay our legislators.
yeah, clearly not what they intended when they created chapter 184, section 32, So, yeah, it's a good question, and I wish you luck with that question. Does that help, Lori?
It sure does,
Yeah,
yeah, thank
yeah.
you. So it doesn't have to be approved by town meeting, or it does? It does, because the sale would have to be.
Exactly, anytime you dispose of property, that has to go to town meeting. Yep, and that's, and then you'd also have to follow the procurement laws too, as well.
Yep.
But though I think those are pretty well understood for any asset the town sells, right? Doesn't matter if it's CPA or not. The big revelation here was, you can't sell it unrestricted, and just say we never did the restriction, so it's unrestricted, and we're just gonna sell it, unrestricted. You have to go through the process as if it had a restriction and get that released, which it makes sense, right? You shouldn't be rewarded for not having done what you should have done, right?
Right.
You should
And
follow the same
I don't think it was
procedure.
ever intended to
No.
not put a restriction on it.
Yes.
Or sell it unrestricted.
Yep, I mean, obviously, the reason why you've invested all this money and time into it is because you value the historic structure as a town, so.
But to be clear, the Mass Historic Commission is the only body that needs to release it?
That's what it says in section 32.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that,
If it's housing, it would be DHCD. If it's open space, it would be EEA. Recreation land would be EA. Agriculture would be, I think it says Department of Agricultural Services. There's a different one for watershed land, I think, or something. But for historic, it says MHC, which is under Secretary Galvin's office, and is, a very process-oriented state agency. Did you had, I read in your description of all the dealings with MAC just to get them to declare it historically significant years and years ago. That was quite a process.
Yeah, there were two attributes, and it's still not clear in my head. There's one part that has to do with putting it on the National Register, which seems to have different requirements than putting it in on a preservation restriction.
Right.
So I've started to appreciate those differences. And so we got it to the point where we could, MHC said we could put a preservation restriction on it. It's not clear to me regarding the National Register status.
Right.
because they actually want different things.
Yeah, and the National Register really doesn't give you any protection for the building.
No, but the issue really comes if a nonprofit took over or, it has the tax credit benefits.
Yes.
Which were clearly, Metro West clearly identified that on this property, it's almost $2 million.
Right.
So if you don't get the National Register,
It's tough to
you
do
don't
it.
get the tax credits,
Yeah.
that's kind of just something you need to know about.
Right.
So, if there's not any other immediate questions, I wanted to turn the conversation around.
I'm wearing the same sweater as I was wearing.
That's why you wore that all the time.
That was in Phillipston. I got caught. Different pants, though.
So back to White Cliffs.
Yes.
Let's say our mindset is in the other camp, that we're not gonna sell it, okay? I personally want to clarify again what work can be done that qualifies. So I'm back to the chart, which you happen to be pointing at anyway.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
And, you know, we already acquired it, so we can preserve and we can rehabilitate and restore. You know, these things seem obvious, but, there's so many aspects of White Cliffs, if it was to ever be rebuilt enough to occupy, that are not fixing things that are necessarily part of its historic character, but they're all part of the building.
Yes.
So where would we differentiate if the CPC was presented an application for
Yeah.
certain things?
You've got tremendous leeway. I don't have a visual of the definition of the word rehabilitation, but that would be a good one to look at in section 2 of CPA. And, because this is a common question, like, it needs an HVAC system, it needs a complete new electrical system, it needs new boiler, new,
I think we're talking remediation is the key word here.
no, not remediation, rehabilitation, that's the word.
I'm talking about White Cliffs.
Oh, okay, so the definition of rehabilitation says, you know, to anything that, you know, brings the building back to its, you know, former historic glory, including any upgrades to any code work whatsoever. So, modern HVAC codes, modern electrical codes, modern ADA codes, remediation of asbestos and lead paint, all those things are eligible on a historic structure. Really the only things that aren't, are things that are not attached to the building, right? So furniture, you know, things like furniture, fixtures, and equipment are not eligible.
So follow that, parts of White Cliffs property are additions that were not.
Yeah, can you use
Part of the
CPA funds
historic
to rip
building.
them down? Yeah, and so that, I was gonna address that next, cause that's a difficult one. But I think you could make the case, yes. I think that you would have to have, you know, all that documentation that Norm did, you know, and historic preservation consultants, and, you know, officially saying, this is not historic, this would benefit the building from a historic perspective to be removed. I think if you have that evidence, you know, CPA doesn't have regulations, so there's nowhere in the act where you're gonna find that it says you can't use CPA money for that.
Now, on the other hand, if I'm going to demolish the piece that's the addition, you know, it's not part of the original building, I'm not rehabilitating or restoring it.
Well, you have to button up the building after.
Right.
So once you remove the
reducing water
additions, you
infiltration.
have to in a historically appropriate way,
Right,
return the original, exterior of the structure
right,
to the exterior.
yep. So.
Could that
yeah.
all qualify?
Yeah, I think it would. I think that is, you know, and actually says, this might help, actually. It actually says rehabilitation or restoration. And there's no definition of restoration in CPA, but there is an officially recognized historic definition of restoration, which is to return a building to what it was at a certain period in its life. So it does say that both are eligible for CPA money, rehabilitation and restoration.
Does it work, can we return it to when somebody else owned it?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Very good. I don't know. But there's no definition of restoration. So I think actually that would be the avenue for this. We don't see it that much, but
Interesting.
DOR actually gave an example in their IGR of restoration of you have, normal ordinary painting, that you're doing every 10 years is maintenance, right? But they gave an example that said, if you have a building that's at some point someone painted purple, and you know that for 200 years that building was white, and you have documented evidence, restoring it to its original color is restoration, and that would qualify for CPA funding. So I think that's the angle you would take here, is to use restoration, actually, which luckily, to your benefit, does not have a definition, so it's what you guys decide it is. But in the generally, am I correct about, would you agree with that? That in the historic preservation world, restoration does have a definition, which is to bring it back to a certain point in its history.
Right, and the target has always been to bring it back to the original mansion floor.
I think you're absolutely fine there. Now, the question is, once you take that off, the work to bring it back to what it looked like would be fine. But if you also, for your convenience, wanted to add onto the building, like a modern kitchen or something, that would not be something that would be eligible for CPA funds. And that, frankly, was one of the nice things about the housing proposal, because housing, you can build new stuff. So you kind of got the best of both worlds. You have to use that chart to make sure you're matching the expense, right? So the expense of taking off the porch and, restoring it back to what it looked like would be historic restoration down in that box. But the new housing units would be over in the housing box under create, right? So that's how you use that chart. And that was the nice thing about, a proposal like that for this property, is that you can restore the historic and build the new, and you can use CPA money and for all of it. Which any other use, you would not be able to add on to the building. The one exception is if you absolutely have to add on for ADA accessibility, and doing something interior would ruin some of the historic features of the building, then you could have an addition which just had the stairwell or the elevator or something like that. So Hamilton Town Hall, it's the type of town hall, I don't know if you've ever been to a lot of people have been to Provincetown Town Hall. You walk in and there are these matching historic circular staircases, these grand staircases. The Provincetown ones are spectacular. The two in Hamilton Town Hall aren't quite as spectacular, but that's the defining feature of that building when you walk in, is these two matching staircases. To make it handicapped accessible, the selectmen wanted to blow out one of the staircases and put the elevator in there. And the CPC said, no, that's a defining historic feature, you can't do that. And the selectmen said, well, the only other way is to build an addition out back. And that's, a lot more money. And the CPC said, let's build the addition and use CPA money. Because if the only way to do it is gonna hurt some defining historic features, then you could put the elevator outside, because you're actually preserving those historic features. So that's really the only addition on a historic one, would be for those code issues, like ADA accessibility. So, I mean, you've got a lot more tasks that would be just fine there than you have CPA money. Yeah, so that shouldn't be a worry, I don't think.
Okay.
Even with a bond, it's still more than you have, right? There's gotta be other solutions and
These are the
partners.
big questions, yes. That was really helpful, thank you. Board, open it up. Questions on anything else to Stuart? Please speak up.
I think you touched on it earlier. I'm curious on ADA compliance.
Yep.
There was a thing said no sidewalks allowed.
Yes.
But most of the ADA compliant, by statute, you need certain pitch sidewalks and ramps, and I contend somewhat it should be a municipality. They should make everything ADA compliant. But a lot of our proposals we get, they almost seem to throw it in as a sales feature for us. Oh, I'm gonna make it ADA compliant.
Right.
Where's the onus? Is that on the municipality, or is it up to us to try and make every project ADA compliant?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an ADA expert by any means, and every town usually has an ADA coordinator, who was responsible for that. I mean, there are a lot of municipal projects, most municipal projects, where if you exceed a certain threshold of the value of the building, you have to bring it completely up to ADA code. So if you were gonna rehab this building and you spent more, I think it's 30% of assessed value, you have to bring the whole building up to accessibility standards. There are different accessibility standards for playground redos, right? So there are different categories of other laws that you have to adhere to with you know, that aren't in the CPA legislation, but they would apply to any CPA project.
I think, John, didn't we have one actually for a church, right, for an exterior ramp?
Yeah.
We did it at the First Parish Church, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Now-
we did.
See, now that one may be a little questionable, not because, I mean, an exterior ramp for any historic building would be fine, but in the religious category, you know, is it being used by the public or is it being used by the members of the church? You know, so that's a tricky one that you can argue either way.
Well,
Churches
in
are for
that,
public
in that case,
benefit.
I remember that one very well, and the justification was for it is because they were planning to continue to use that building for public concerts and the like. So
Right.
there was, that was the logic written in the.
And usually churches are almost always used for lots of community activities. The question is, how do you guarantee that benefit going forward, right? Because, you know, someone trips and falls and their liability insurance triples, and all of a sudden they say, we can't rent it out, we can't let the community use this building anymore, and you've just invested in that handicap ramp. So these are, you know, a lot of times that can be handled with a grant agreement with a clawback clause that says if you ever stop having public buildings, you owe us the money back or something like that. But
We approved that long before Acton anyway, so.
yeah. Good. Yeah, but ADA generally, you know, especially on historic buildings, is allowed. You know, the trick on historic buildings is how do you do the ADA upgrades and not ruin the historic features? And, you know, there is something in Boston called the Architectural Access Board, and you can apply for waivers, you know. Like we had a Grange building that we used $1 million of CPA money in my town to fix up, and they had these beautiful wooden, you know, handrails, beautiful as they went down, but they were, you know, like 2 inches, you know, too high or too low or something like that. And so they got a waiver to leave those, but then add a second handrail for handicap accessibility at the proper height, but they left the beautiful wooden ones as well. But they had to get a waiver from the Architectural Access Board for that. So it's difficult on historic buildings, but it can be done, and it's usually required if you're spending more than a certain amount of the assessed value of the building. You know, a little less clear, I don't think there are too many regulations on making parks accessible. You know, there's some playground regulations.
The dog park, we're doing a dog park project, and we had to make it accessible.
You did, okay.
And the same with playgrounds.
Yep, yeah, playgrounds, I know there's lots of regulations on that. And a lot of CPA money spent to make wonderful ADA accessible playgrounds.
We just did.
Yeah, great. Usually has to do with the surface, making it
Quite a bit, yeah.
a great, those
Came out
pour-in-place
great,
rubber.
too, that was,
Did they use a pour-in-place rubber, that rubberized? Yeah, that's awesome stuff.
The project was sort of expedited because of a claim made against the town.
Right, they had to do something.
And, you know, but fortunately, we had the ability, and it turned out to be a great, you know, great asset to the park. It's much nicer than it was, even though it was a good park before.
Yeah, those pour-in-place things are they're fantastic services, but they're really expensive.
Yeah, I know. Everything's expensive in the town.
Yeah.
Even the dog park, it's over $500 grand.
Wow.
And it's not fancy,
Yeah.
so.
Just handicapped dogs.
Just a little dog.
My favorite expensive municipal project story was when we're going to install a new HVAC system in our historic community center, which is our senior center. And I was chair of the CPC, and I was meeting with the contractor and the Council on Aging director, and we had the proposal in front of us, and we were talking about the project, and Pam, the senior citizens director, said, you did you did put in the prevailing wage and the, you know, procurement, proper procurement in this to the vendor. And he was like, oh, you're right, this is a public building. He goes, do you have that proposal? And he takes the piece of paper from Pam, and he takes and crosses out the 20,000 and handwrites on there 40,000 and hands it back to her. So, because it was in a public building, it was gonna cost twice as much as you could do it in your house. And we were, Pam and I were like, he goes, oh yeah, I forgot it was a public building, yeah, that's the quote. He wrote it big too, it was like a sharp 1,000, crossed out the 20.
Any other questions for Stuart? Well, thank you very much for bringing this, Mr. Chairman.
Very useful.
Send you this tomorrow morning, and then if anyone has any follow-up questions, let us know.
That'd be great, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right?
It's a great help. I don't think it's the last time you'll hear from us, but you've given us much to work with. Thank you.
Nice sweater.
Does that go under historic now? Or?
All right, we'll let you shut down and we'll kind of keep going. We don't have much more business. But it's interesting because some of your comments apply to the papers in front of us. We are going to do a brief look at the applications we've received so far, and so we'll do that. First on my pile is from Rick Leaf, who got mentioned today, and it's with regard to the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund. And Rick is famous for his voluminous writings in his applications. So the executive summary is that he wants more money in the Affordable Reserve, and he wants to reapprove the previously voted amounts as per our funding agreement. And so, as he properly does every year, brings it back to the CPC to approve and onward to the Select Board to approve previous amounts so that they are still available for the potential of new projects. So that's a pretty straightforward application. I don't think anyone have any questions on it. Number two in my pile is from the Recreation Commission with regard to the Milliken Middle School outdoor recreation courts, tennis courts, basketball courts. And this seems consistent with projects we have approved in the past. And we have previously approved projects at Milliken, which have been very successful, so. Quick look at applicability, it seems to be right up there, right? Speak up if anybody has any more knowledge on anything, okay?
You wanna wait till Stuart leaves?
No, if we have a question, he's still here, we'll just claw him back in.
Didn't we
Make him
do,
adjunct member.
didn't we do the basketball courts?
Yeah, outside.
No, I know, but the ones that they're asking for the money, wasn't that courts
no,
that
no,
were?
it
That
was,
was in the elementary schools,
It
wasn't
was,
it?
yeah, mostly elementary schools. Well, no, to your point, some of it was there, so we're redoing it.
The middle school, and I actually coincidentally talked to somebody on the basketball board about this. I didn't even know we had this application, but he had said that the middle school during the pandemic had stored like containers on the courts that ruined the surface.
Oh, really?
But that's a question for,
Okay, good. We'll look-
Stored containers?
we'll look deeper.
some sort of, I don't know. I'll track down more information.
Antivirals or something?
Yeah. Is that where they put the sick people? I don't know. It's worth looking at the detail. The third one I have is interesting. It's an application for an historic marker to replace the same historic marker. And thank you very much
so much,
again.
Stuart. Thank you so much.
So I think we'll discuss this further at the next meeting, but with regard to the more thorough explanation of applicable uses, I don't think the signs ever applied.
No, because
Yeah,
it's not a document, we're not preserving it.
yeah, we may have snuck some through.
We were, in each case, we are, you know, trying to enhance the historical asset. And we felt that we had vetted it, you know, along those lines.
I'm trying to remember, because we've been doing these for.
We can't create a new thing, right? It's not, the sign is, in itself is not the historic research.
Correct, but my recollection is, somewhere I remember reading that it had to do with education. And I'd have to go back and see what it was, that it was to educate the population on some of these historic sites.
Has Stuart left the building yet? God, we could have his.
He got out, as soon as he heard he might be dragged back in.
Ran quickly.
Just heard him
In
squeal out.
some cases, they are strictly that. In other cases, if you look at what we were doing in the cemeteries, where all this work that we've been investing in the cemeteries, putting up the signs in the cemeteries, really fit the overall cemetery project.
That's true.
But again, my recollection is somewhere, there's an angle of education, and that's the purpose.
So take the cemetery case, for instance, you know, the Brigham Street.
Yep.
You're restoring it, you're rehabilitating the burial ground, the sign is part of that, I think that's clear. At Howard Street, you know, we've rehabilitated certain aspects of it. The signs are part of that, so I think that applies. But when we look at this particular marker, that's simply educating with regard to the Aqueduct Bridge, not that it wouldn't be great to replace it, it seems like it maybe was not applicable in the first place.
Yeah.
So we have to give that some thought.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, if picking on that one sign, there is a program to look at the aqueduct in terms of a big picture, right? So
Maybe we should bundle it there.
it's not that far off in terms of topic, since we're trying to get to the thing about opening the aqueduct for pedestrians. So it's, granted, we put the sign in 5 years, maybe before that's gonna happen, but you're right, it probably should be thought through. I'm kind of taking a back seat now on this, so poor Bob.
I didn't know that it was gone until I
Yeah.
saw your application.
I noticed it was gone October 7th. I walked by and it was missing.
Are there any hints on where it went? Was it just run over, or was it?
No, it was unbolted and
Definitely stolen.
And they got 30 cents when they brought it in.
Sorry?
They probably got 30 cents when they brought it into,
Or for scrap.
metal scrap.
It's
Yeah.
probably hanging on somebody's wall.
they are expensive signs.
They're expensive, but bringing material back.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
right, yeah.
you know, that people think that it's brass or bronze and they're gonna get a lot of money these days, but it's not the truth.
So we'll bring it up again, you know, next meeting, sure.
Right. I probably won't be here, but Bob will be.
Okay.
The chair.
Thank you. I know I speak to you as if you are still in the commission.
He is, he just
Mr.
doesn't, he is, he just
Commissioner
doesn't.
Emeritus.
He is, he just doesn't know it.
All right, well, thank you for reconfirming, Leslie. The next application that we got in is from the, sponsored by the Open Space Committee. Surprise, surprise. And it's for Conservation Fund money. And, you've heard from us before. You're gonna hear from us again. And the last one that we've got in is the thickest, and it regards the First Parish Church restoration of the steeple and area, which we talked about last year, and we talked about tonight. And so, maybe do we take his advice and start right off and get some town
I
council
was gonna say,
opinion?
we were just given very clear advice tonight
Yeah.
that we should send it immediately over, so.
I can send that over.
Something we should start? Why not? Okay, thank you. Could you let council know we're meeting again 1st of December, and then maybe if they had any time to advise prior to that.
Yep.
Not required, but that'd be great.
Peter, I kind of want to get your thoughts on this too, but do we want to have an opinion of town council? Because then we might be constrained by it. And I kind of think that, and Stuart had said that town council was like the ultimate arbiter of this stuff. I kind of think that the 9 people here
Yeah.
set the community standards as to what we think should be an allowable project, and not town
Something-
council
something-
who's going to give a conservative opinion to save money.
Something less than an opinion.
Right.
Okay.
I just throw that out there as giving opinions myself for a living. Sometimes there's things going on in the background that.
I get you. What about if we pause on doing that until we get more detail? Because tonight's meeting was not to study it.
No, I know, but I also don't want to kick off that process unless we feel we need to.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you for the advice. Why don't we cancel the request for right now? Let's get into it in more detail in just a second. Maybe we'll come armed with some precedent. We talked about it before without, our concerns were not whether it was applicable based on, the things Stuart talked about tonight, but more so that it was well-prepared, I thought. Didn't we speak to that level to the applicant? That they didn't really seem to have the costs in line. They were looking for more detail, looking for other sources. I didn't think it was really not completely well justified yet, and we were on a mindset to sort of save our resources for other things last year.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for the advice from council,
Yeah, right.
our own council. Thank you, councilors. Any other information on applications? Do we know of any that are coming in that people said, oh, we forgot? No?
Anything from White Cliffs other than the debt?
Well, I have reached out to an architect, about the demolition and the buttoning up of the building afterwards, having to do with the 1970s additions. And we're supposed to have a more formal discussion in the middle of November when he returns from Europe. So, that's why I asked the question about the administration funds, because I don't have a quote or anything ready to go for this round. There is an interest in applying to grant funds, but obviously there needs to be funding for the architectural services in order to be eligible to apply for the grant funds, because they require quotes. So,
This would be the architectural services just for the demo.
architectural services for the demo and the buttoning up the building in a historically appropriate manner.
So I feel like the takeaway from Stuart reiterating the applicability of the administrative fund is that if an application was submitted for demolishing the addition and buttoning up the building in a historic fashion, then the CPC can determine if we need outside resources to advise on the costs involved, or to verify the application, or to add information to the application. Then I think we'd be in a position where it would apply, not the other way around.
Would the CPC expect a cost estimate for the demolition work?
Well, you
Because
should.
I need the architectural services in order to come up with a cost estimate.
So now we come back to where, in almost every other project of any similar nature that's come up in the last, let's say, 10 years, town staff, through the administrator at the time, would advise, this needs to be broken into a project whereby the first phase is we go get the real cost.
Right.
The second phase is we approve it. And perhaps it applies here. As much as there's a sense of urgency to do something, the right thing to do might be exactly that. But the project itself is, it needs to be defined in some way and sponsored by somebody that says, we wanna do this and that to White Cliffs, and then, you know, and so that's the application, and then
Right.
we'd be bringing the, it would be a project, you bring the project to town meeting, however, the project is in phase 1 and phase 2.
But didn't he have on his slide that the administrative fund had no, like, no project? It had no project
Project
basis.
expenses, right?
Yeah,
So is it money spent to help this body make a decision,
Mm-hmm.
or for the town to
Right.
make a
No,
decision?
it's this body.
Right.
Now,
or
if
if it's like part of that project, it should be in the project cost, it shouldn't be an administrative cost. That's
Right.
how I read
Yeah.
that thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
So if it's a two-phase project and phase 1 is doing all this consulting work, then we're not using the admin fund anyway.
Right.
Is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, but we've had those thoughts before where we thought we could use that
Correct,
to better define things prior to
right.
it, or to expedite.
Yeah, the goal was always thinking that we could clarify the project and then move it forward that year. But we were vetting applications where the cost estimates were not thorough enough, and eventually, you know, kind of collectively and with town staff help, we're coming to the conclusion that we've really gotta get the right numbers before you go to town meeting, rather than going to town meeting with a number and then having to come back to town meeting and say we didn't have enough. Or, you know, we're trying to fill in the gap a different way, and so it's frustrating, cause you're waiting an extra year, but it's what got the town common done, even though it took 1 or 2 extra years, and it's what got some other things done too, so.
There is also
The
another,
Melican lighting, for instance, right, wasn't that?
there is
We
a
went to 1 year
funding
to get the right
source
cost.
to
Things
do
like
the
that.
exploratory work, that's grant. So it's possible to have them fund the services of the architect, and then come to you and have you fund the actual demolition work. So that's another possibility, because that grant application is due in May or June. So the timing might work well to get the solid cost estimates on the demo work
For the following cycle.
for the next cycle
Yeah.
for CPC.
Okay.
But, I mean, I made this comment, I think, the last time I was at a meeting, which is, I'd kinda like to know what the plan is ultimately, rather than to just show people we're doing things for the sake of doing things.
I hear ya.
Valid point.
We are working on getting a facilitator, a community facilitator. I spoke with somebody today, who sounded really excited about the project and was very familiar with White Cliffs personally. So I should be getting a quote and a scope of work next week, and hopefully that will get us rolling in a good direction.
Okay, anything else on applications, questions? We have one more piece of work, and that is approving the minutes. Anyone, you know, can read them out loud if they'd like to, otherwise I'll take a motion to approve.
Make a motion to approve.
Seconded.
Andy, seconded by
Andy.
Andy and Andy, yeah.
Big gift to say.
I approve that we accept the minutes from October 5th, 2023 as presented.
Andy, did you still second it?
I will.
Thank you very much.
He did.
You know what's great about this meeting? We can just say all in favor.
Aye, aye.
I wasn't here, so.
I wasn't here.
Thank you. So, we had, of 9 members, 7 were here?
6.
Were you here, Todd?
I was
mean,
not.
Sean?
Yes, I was here.
Okay.
Yeah, he was there.
He's on the phone.
I'm not listed under present
Pete,
or
were you there?
absent, I just noticed.
Leslie wasn't here.
Well, I'm not,
Jeff
so
was here.
Andy's listed as, Andy's
Andy's
listed as
twice
Clark,
been.
twice attended, and I'm not,
He and his doppelganger.
Oh, wow.
so I must be
Oh, no, why? Because I have us all on my phone and my computer.
Double Andy.
I think
I was
that's,
present, but,
I think
All right,
somebody,
so
We were
John,
president as
Peter,
Andy Clark.
yeah, 'cause I
one
did it
Andy,
from my,
two
I did
Andys.
it from my,
Sean, and Leslie was there or
let
not?
me double check.
Oh, you weren't there? No, we had to look at it. It's
Pretty
fine.
sure I was here. Double check.
Yeah, I think you were.
Yeah, I was here.
So Leslie, so 6-0, 3 abstaining on the minutes. You got that right?
Right.
Okay. How about a motion to adjourn? So moved. Thank you. All in favor? Great meeting, people. Thank you for coming.
thanks for setting it up.